high school well. And we have a focus on talking about how history connects to the world we live in today. So today we'll be talking about the civil rights movement, which was a time here in the 1950s and 1960s when people were fighting for freedoms for black people here in the United States. But we don't just want to talk about what happened in the past, we also want to connect it to our world today. Think about what is what's going on in our world today in terms of discrimination, in terms of people being treated unequally, connect to ways that people were discriminated against in the past, and how do ordinary people fight for a better world. So these are just a couple of questions that we're going to be thinking about a little bit today. But I'd like to start by thinking about the name of this bus. So you all are on the Mobile Museum of Tolerance. Now, just as a show of hands, who here has heard that word tolerance before? So a lot of us have. I want you to think about a situation where you've heard that word tolerance before. Maybe think about the words you've heard it combined with. What do you guys think of when you think of the word tolerance?
Yeah, like the way you act.
The way you act, absolutely. It has a lot to do with how we act and how we treat other people.
Yeah. Respectfulness.
Respectfulness, yeah. Red shirt?
Like kind of unacceptable kind of thing.
Yeah, so sometimes, if somebody is intolerant or somebody doesn't tolerate something, it means they don't accept something. Next to you, yeah.
I was going to say kind of how you handle something.
How you handle something, absolutely. Now, I want you to think of a situation where somebody has recently done something to annoy you. Or maybe your younger sibling has got on your nerves. Maybe a classmate has done something that bugs you. In that situation, did you immediately start screaming at them, swinging your fist, starting a fight? Probably not in most cases, right? So in those situations where we choose to kind of be the bigger person, we choose to show respect, we choose to not kind of feed into that negative energy, that's a situation where somebody would show tolerance. And so tolerance among, people within a society is about saying, this person might be different from me. Maybe we have different opinions, different backgrounds. Maybe our beliefs are different. Maybe we're of a different race or gender, or sexuality, religion. No matter what the differences are between us, we can still treat each other the way that we want to be treated. Now, the opposite of tolerance, the opposite of accepting and respecting people is hate. And one particular form of hate that I want to zero in on today is discrimination. Now, discrimination is a legally recognized form of hate. That means, for example, if, for example, somebody went to go apply for a job and they were turned down for that job because of their race, they would have grounds to stand on if they wanted to go after that employer and say, I was discriminated against for my race. I was judged for my race and for who I am. Not because I had done anything wrong, not because I was a bad candidate, just because of who I am. And that employer could then potentially face consequences for, again, discrimination. So, racism, that's just one form of discrimination that we hear about happening. But there are other forms of discrimination that you guys have, heard about, learned about, maybe even experienced yourself. Other forms of discrimination that we hear about happening in our world. Yeah.
Homophobia.
Homophobia, absolutely. People being discriminated against for their sexuality, who they love and have relationships with. Yeah, sexism, definitely. So, we have a long history of, women's rights in this country. And women have had to fight for freedoms like the right to vote. Earlier, the right to go to college, to get a job outside the home. More recently, to be paid equally to men. For, girls to be able to play sports in school. So there are lots of different, civil rights battles that we can connect to sexism as well. Back in the back row.
Xenophobia.
Xenophobia, absolutely. Now, xenophobia is specifically, discrimination against people from other countries. So this, for example, could be people saying to somebody that's speaking a different language here in the U.S., we're in America, speak English. People mistreating immigrants, people who have recently come to this country. Xenophobia is a major one that happens.
Transphobia.
Transphobia, absolutely. You talked about homophobia being connected to the LGBTQ community, and transphobia is as well. So transphobia is a discrimination against transgender people whose gender identity is different from the one that they were born with. And so that's another major form of discrimination that happens too. So we've got lots of different forms of discrimination and hate that happen in our world. And it can be based on things that you are, things like your race, your gender, your sexuality. It can be based on things that you believe too. As an example, people sometimes face discrimination for their religious beliefs. Here on this bus, we're run by a Jewish organization. So we often talk about what we call anti-Semitism, discrimination against Jewish people. Sometimes we hear about it happening in the past with things like the Holocaust, the event during the 1930s and 1940s when millions of Jewish people were killed. But it happens today too. For example, Jewish schools, Jewish synagogues or places of worship often have to have armed guards there to protect the people inside because there's been a history of acts of violence against Jewish schools and synagogues. People that are Muslim in this country face Islamophobia, discrimination against Muslims. After 9/11 here in this country, a lot of Americans developed, a distrust and hatred and racism towards people that are Muslim, not because they had done anything wrong, just because of stereotypes and connecting them with the people who carried out 9/11. Those stereotypes were false. So you can see, when people are exposed to that misinformation and people start to believe in those generalizations about a group of people, there's a pretty severe impact of how they're going to treat those people. So we saw a huge rise in, hate and violence against Muslim people in this country. Something that's still happening today, but especially, 15, 20 years ago. I think I saw your hand here in the background. Did you have something to add?
Okay.
Great, yeah. So we, we have lots of different forms of discrimination that happen. And it's targeted for things that we are, things that we believe. And so it's important to stand up against discrimination because we're fighting for a world where people are able to be and believe what they believe without being treated unequally. A lot of these things like our race, our gender, are things that we can't really hide. Things like our sexuality or our religious beliefs. Those are things that we shouldn't have to hide. And people should be treated equally no matter who they are. So that's why it's so important if we recognize that discrimination is happening today. And we take an active role in trying to make our world a more equal place for everybody. Now that's exactly what people were doing during the civil rights movement. This was a time 60 years ago when we had thousands, millions even of people getting involved in a movement against racial discrimination. Because our country has had racism as part of our history pretty much from the beginning. If you think about what you know about U.S. history, we have hundreds of years of slavery in our history. Generations of people that essentially had no rights, no freedoms. So once the slaves were freed in the 1860s, the rights between black people and white people in this country weren't automatically equal to each other. In fact, we entered into an era called the Jim Crow era in the South, but there were effects of it in other areas of the country as well. But there were lots of laws and systems that were put into place to limit black people's freedoms in this country. Things like segregation, having separate public places like schools, restaurants, even things like buses, bathrooms. Discrimination in housing. Whole cities or neighborhoods that would bar people of color from buying homes there. Discrimination in jobs and who was able to register to vote. So we're going to get a sense of some of these different forms of discrimination that existed during the civil rights movement, some of the things that people were up against during the civil rights movement in this film that I'm about to show you. I know everything in this film is taking place in the past. A lot of these clips are going to be old newsreel clips in black and white. But I also want you to keep our world today in mind too while you're watching this film. Just kind of ask yourself while you're watching this, am I seeing anything that's reminding me of anything that I've seen or heard or learned about here in the last couple of years? So watch the video now. We'll have a couple of minutes to talk about it afterwards. But for now, does anyone have any questions? All right. Thank you all so much. Oh, yeah, I'm here.
Is there like a background of who's going to be in the video or film clip?
Are you asking who's going to be talking in the video?
Yeah, is there a background?
Is there a background of people?
Yeah, are there going to be people that we know?
Potentially, yeah. So we're going to see, Dr. Martin Luther King. That's a figure that probably a lot of us will recognize. We're going to see President John F. Kennedy. He was the president during some of these core years in the middle of the civil rights movement in the early 1960s. We're also going to see a man named John Lewis. Now, that may be a new name to a few of us, but John Lewis was somebody who was an anti-segregation activist. He was involved with a group that we call the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And later in his life, he became a U.S. congressman as well. Yeah.
How long were some of these?
Yeah, good question. So this was taking place, we consider the core years to be about 1955 to 1968. Now, there were actions that people were taking earlier in the 1950s and even in earlier decades. And people still were fighting for civil rights after, the 1960s. We consider those to be about the core years, mid-1950s to late 1960s. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Great, yeah, great questions. So I hope you guys enjoy the video. We'll have more time to talk about it afterwards, but I hope this is informative and teaches you a little bit about what was going on during this really important time in our history.
Ain't you got a right? Ain't you got a right? Ain't you got a right? Ain't you got a right to feel alive? Ooh, ain't you got a right?
This is not a local problem, Chuck. This is a national problem. You can't keep anyone in the United States supported without hurting the rights of all other citizens. Democracy is built on this. This is why every man has the right to vote, regardless. It's what I'm saying, too. Is it what you think?
100 years after the Civil War, a new battle was fought for freedom in America. It was a non-violent movement that challenged American democracy toward a new vision of itself.
We must come to see that the end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. And that will be a day not of the white man, not of the black man. That will be the day of man as man.
Until the 1960s, there existed in America two societies, separate and unequal, one for whites and one for people of color. Liberty and justice, the right to vote, equal protection under the law were guaranteed in the nation's constitution, but were not available to all Americans.
I was born into a system that was segregated and denied blacks the right to vote, also denied women the right to vote.
In one corner of the store, sometime in the same corner, there would be a shining fountain for white people to get water to drink. Then in the same corner, in another corner of the store, there would be a spigot for black people to get water to drink.
If you were born into a system that's wrong, whether it's a slave system or whether it's a segregated system, you take it for granted.
I came to resent the system of segregation and racial discrimination. I hated the system, and I wanted to find a way to defy it.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny. And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. They come in and they sit down, and we're not used to them sitting down beside us because I wasn't raised with them. I never have lived with them, and I'm not going to start now. In the name of God, whom we all revere. In the name of liberty, we hold so dear. In the name of decency, which we all cherish. What is happening in America? I don't have but one message as I journey around this country. And it is a message which says that I am convinced the most potent weapon available to oppress people as they struggle for freedom and justice is the weapon of nonviolence.
The movement had a way of reaching inside me and bringing out things that I never knew were there. Courage and love for people.
That's what many people don't understand about what happened back in the Deep South. That here I am. That this is my duty. I've got to do something. And God is with me. And if God is with me, how can you lose leaning on the everlasting arm?
I guess our courage came out because we didn't have nothing, and we couldn't lose nothing. But we wanted something for ourselves and for our children. And so we took a chance with our lives.
Movement meant that finally we were encountering on a mass scale the evil that had been destroying us on a mass scale. You do not walk away from and that you continue to answer it.
Sir, whenever there are men who are in a sinful condition, prayer should be uttered wherever they are.
Why don't you pray where you are? Go back down and pray. You think you lily white? You think you're not sinful, huh? Well, then go back to your church and pray.
Well, sir, can we pray together, you and I?
You do your prayer, I do mine, big boy. You don't pray for me. I don't want you to pray for
What
me.
will you pray for us?
Because I don't think your prayers get above your head.
What will you pray for us?
No, I'm not going to pray for you. I'll tell them my business, you tell to you, and they serve these people out of here.
Sir, sir,
I don't have to love anybody I don't want to love.
sir,
You do your own love. You love your little niggas. I love who I please.
If you were black, we had one right. That was the right to die, not to live. And we wanted to change that. Kill me now. But you want to kill my children. They'll have the right. The doors were open for
I just thought during that period, it was just too much, too many funerals. And some of us would say, how many more?
It is not enough to pin the blame on others, to say this is the problem of one section of the country or another, or to deplore the facts that we face. A great change is at hand, and our task, our obligation, is to make that revolution, that change, peaceful and constructive for all.
my freedom is very much entangled with the freedom of every other man. And that if another man is not free, then I'm not free. So I'm fighting for my own freedom here.
We must come to see that the end we seek is a society at peace with itself, a society that can live with its conscience. That will be a day not of the white man, not of the black man. That will be the day of man as man. However difficult the moment, yes, sir. However frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed earth will rise again. Yes, how long? Not long. Yes, because no lie can live forever. Yes, how long? Not long. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Yes, how long? Not long. Because my eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He's trampling out the village where the grapes of wrath are stored. He's loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. Glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
Alrighty, so hope you learned something new from that film. Does anyone have any questions about anything that you saw in the film? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm guessing what is it, with the protesters were running from the IT stuff? What did they use?
So they were hitting them with batons. There was one point where, protesters were being sprayed with fire hoses. In fact, let's think about that for a second. Do you guys remember any other scenes of, peaceful protesters from the video? How are they actually being treated? Disrespect, right? Yeah. There was that one clip where we have, this young protester being confronted by an older white police officer. And just so you guys know, that young protester's name was Jimmy Webb. He was only 16 years old when that video was recorded. So imagine somebody, not that much older than yourselves. And, a lot of activists during the civil rights movement were young people. Teenagers, people in their early 20s. So imagine the courage that somebody had must have had to, put themselves in a situation where they could, be spoken to in the way that Jimmy Webb was spoken to in that video. Hearing people call him a slur, saying, I don't have to love anyone I don't want to love. We had clips of people being, physically harmed, being beaten, being sprayed with fire hoses. There was also a clip of people being arrested. I don't know if you remember, there was that scene of people having the American flag taken out of their hand. Those guys were actually being loaded up onto a police van and taken to jail. Something important to keep in mind about the civil rights movement is that, it was a dangerous time for protesters and activists. They were up against a lot. And I think the fact that so many, regular, ordinary people were willing to get involved in this just shows us how important those rights and freedoms were that people were sticking up for. So we definitely need to think about what activists were facing during this time. I have these words here in front of you. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. These were written almost 250 years ago, but I think they're really relevant to, understanding the civil rights movement and understanding our world today too. When you read over these words, especially the second half, all men are created equal, what do you get out of this quote? What do you think the message is here?
Yeah, and we should be treated just like
Definitely, others should be treated equally, just how you yourself would like to be treated.
yeah. No one deserves to have different rights because of their skin color.
Absolutely. Nobody deserves to have different rights just because of their skin color, and even further than that, really anything about themselves.
Yeah.
It kind of points out the fact that we're all human and not one better than each other and not worse than each other.
Absolutely. I like that phrase, we're all human. Nobody's better than each other. We're all born equal, and so we all should be treated the same. And I think it's pretty clear, thinking about what we know about U.S. history, thinking about what we saw in the video, that we haven't really lived up to this idea yet. We haven't had a country where everybody was treated equally and had equal rights. And so let's think about what we saw in the video. Certainly the way the protesters were treated was one way that people were treated unequally, but what were other forms of discrimination or inequality that you noticed in the film? Yeah, go for it.
The segregation, like the fountains.
Yeah, segregation, and we noticed the example with the water fountains. I mentioned somebody earlier named John Lewis. He was actually the person that was telling us about those water fountains. I want you to think about how he described those drinking fountains. He described the one that white people got to drink out of as shining. It was clean. It was probably similar to one that you'd use today. Whereas the drinking fountain that black people had to drink out of, he described as a spigot, and what you would propose it to on the side of a house. So people called this system of segregation separate but equal. We could see how it was separate with those water fountains, but it was far, far, far from equal. So what were some other things we saw in the video that were segregated? More than just water fountains.
Yeah. There was where there was like a different entrance for the white people and for people.
Yeah, so sometimes, completely separate entrances. Yeah.
Bathrooms had to be segregated too.
Bathrooms, absolutely. Yeah, the back row.
When the John Lewis person was talking about, then the white person said that he should go back to his own church for black people.
Yeah, so churches were segregated as well. And what's interesting about that scene is, peaceful protesters asking to pray with people, that was a pretty common strategy that they would use. Now you'll notice that police officer told Jimmy Webb, I don't think your prayers get above your head. So even though they were both Christians, they both believed in the same God, he didn't even view their beliefs as being equivalent. Yeah.
Schools were segregated?
Schools, absolutely. We saw a really famous clip of a girl named Ruby Bridges being walked into her school. Ruby Bridges is someone that was even younger than you guys during the civil rights movement. She was 6 years old in that video. She was the first black student in her city to attend what had once been an all-white school. She was part of that effort to help integrate schools, to have students of different races attend the same schools and have the same access to resources to help them learn. Yeah. Restaurants, absolutely. And this was a major scene for, protests against segregation. Down here.
Kind of like the house floods when he said he wasn't going to start looking for black people then.
Yeah, housing as well. So sometimes there would be whole cities, whole neighborhoods where, people were segregated. White people and black people would not live together. There were cities that would bar black people from buying homes there in the first place. And so there was a lot that people were up against during the civil rights movement in terms of, rights and freedoms people were fighting for. And you think about what our public spaces look like today. Certainly not segregated like they were, we saw in the video. So the civil rights movement moved us forward in a lot of ways. more people have the right to vote today. People can marry somebody of a different race across our country. It wasn't until 1962 in a case called Loving versus Virginia that people were guaranteed that right across the United States. The civil rights movement moved us forward in a lot of ways, but I want to think about this quote one more time. Jump forward to our world today. Do you guys feel like we're living up to this yet? Do we treat everybody equally, give everybody equal rights in 2021? So for those of you that are shaking your heads, where are we still unequal?
You can say that we're equal like physically, like we're not segregated anymore. So there's no discrimination of right? But like as we know, there's like a new thing, like the internet, and then there's everything like inside, and it's still not it's not as bad as it was like back then, but it's still not what we wanted to live up to. Like Seba, we were going to live up to, kind of like homophobia, sexism, all that still exists. Right. So people are still trying to hide that. It's kind of hard to find it on the internet, but you can still find it. It's still there.
Yeah, absolutely. All of these different forms of discrimination that we talked about earlier in this session, most of those, if not all of those, still exist. I like that you mentioned the internet. That's another place where that hate is able to spread today. So it's important to be aware of where our world is still unequal today, and think about actions that you as an ordinary person can take to make your world a better place. All of us have a part in pushing our world forward, making our world a more equal place, treating our peers equally. And so as you're leaving the bus, as you're going throughout your day, I want you to think about ways that you can make a difference. How can you make your school, your community, your world a more equal and accepting place for everyone? Now, that doesn't always take big action. Sometimes it's just showing kindness and respect to the other people that you encounter. Maybe it's joining clubs and communities with people. Maybe it's volunteering and helping out people in your community. There are lots of different actions that you can take as ordinary people that make a huge difference in your world. So I hope you continue to think about that as you're going throughout your day. I want to thank you all so much for joining me here this morning. I know our session was short, so I really appreciate you guys joining us. We're going to go ahead and have the first row stand up first and head out these doors. Second and third row can follow. Have a nice your day. Thanks so much.
Oh my gosh.
Want to come on in, find a seat, try to fill in every seat. There's Hey, everybody, welcome. So if you guys could go into the bathroom first, yeah, perfect.
It's hot here.
Right in the middle row. Well, I can see.
Right here.
Well, I'm sitting right here. I can see.
I can't see from up here. Just sit right
I actually kind of regret this.
Yeah, I kind of.
Oh, I can see.
As we get started, is there anybody who can see the screen? Okay. I appreciate how quickly you guys got here, how quickly you got on the bus. I appreciate your patience with one another. Please give your attention to Elizabeth and enjoy kind of your first field trip in a couple of years. I know it didn't go far, but it's a start. We're heading in the right direction. Enjoy 8th grade.
Alrighty, so good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Mobile Museum of Tolerance. Like she mentioned, my name is Elizabeth, and you guys are going to be with me for the next 40 minutes or so. Now, we're going to be talking about how history connects to the world we live in today. This bus actually tours around the state of Illinois to different middle schools just like yours. We go to high schools as well. And we talk about a couple of different historical periods. Now, today we're going to be going into the Civil Rights Movement. This was a time in the 50s and 60s right here in the U.S. when people were fighting for racial equality. We'll be talking about, more of the details of what happened during this time later. But I don't just want to think about, what was going on during the 1950s and 1960s. We're also going to look at questions like, what is discrimination? How does it look in 2021? What forms does it take? We're also going to be looking at, actions that you guys as ordinary people can take to make your world a better place. So a couple of things you guys have to look forward to. First, I want to start by thinking about the name of this bus. I know I'm talking a lot here at the beginning, but I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say as well. So let's start by thinking about the name of this bus. You all are on the Mobile Museum of Tolerance. Now, just as a show of hands, who here has heard that word tolerance before? All right, so most of us, I want you to think about maybe where you've heard this word before. Words you've heard it combined with, maybe situations you've heard it used. Anyone want to take a guess at what we mean when we say tolerance? What does it mean to tolerate somebody or tolerate something? Yeah, down here.
Like, I don't know, never mind.
If it comes back to you, feel free to raise your hand again. Anyone have any other, what do you think of when you think of the word tolerance? What comes to mind?
To be able to respect someone.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it, to be able to respect someone. What else comes to mind when you think of the word tolerance? Have you heard the word pain tolerance, maybe? Lactose intolerance? Yeah, down here. To deal with something or someone, if we talk about somebody's pain tolerance, that's how much pain they can deal with, right? Yeah. To allow, absolutely. If you tolerate something, you're allowing something. For example, if a school says we don't tolerate bullying, clearly that means they don't allow bullying. They don't accept bullying in the school. And so when we think about tolerance between, different groups of people, individuals, it's not necessarily about, being a person's best friend, being their biggest fan. Sometimes it's about just treating them with the same respect and kindness that you'd like to receive in return. And so tolerance among, different groups of people within a society is about saying, all right, this person or this group of people is different from me. Maybe we have different nationalities. Maybe we're from different places. Maybe we have different political beliefs or religious beliefs. Maybe we're of a different race or gender or sexuality. No matter what the differences are between us, we can still treat each other the way that we want to be treated. We can still show people kindness and respect. And so we want to get to the point where we're tolerating and accepting people, because the opposite side of this is hate. One particular form of hate that I want to focus in on today is discrimination. Discrimination that's a legally recognized form of hate, which means that, just as an example, if somebody were to apply for a job and they found out that they were turned down for that job because of their race, they could claim that that employer discriminated against them. That employer could face consequences for turning somebody down, not because they had done anything wrong, but just because of who they were and their race. And so racism, now that's one, of course, major form of discrimination that we hear about happening, both in the past, but in our world today too. What are other forms of discrimination that you've, heard or learned about, read about? What else do people experience discrimination for? Yeah.
Their sexuality.
Absolutely, their sexuality. LGBT people, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people especially face discrimination for who they love, who they have relationships with. And here in our country, for example, Gay people didn't have the right to get married nationwide until 2015. In many states, people weren't able to get married to the person that they loved up until that year. Protections in the workplace, too, going back to people being denied jobs because of who they are. People have been denied jobs because they're gay. But there were protections in place to protect LGBT people from that type of discrimination across the United States until 2020. So we can see this is another group of people that historically has experienced discrimination. Yeah.
Disabilities?
Disabilities, absolutely. And we call this form of discrimination ableism. Now, this can be, for example, public spaces not being accessible to those with physical disabilities. It can be people mistreating others that have disabilities, whether that's a physical disability, whether that's what we call an invisible disability. Things that may not show up on a person's surface, but it's still part of their experience in the world. So discriminating against people for disabilities, that's another major form as well. Any other forms of discrimination that we've heard or learned about happening in our world today? Yeah. Gender, absolutely. Sexism. We have, a history of women's rights sort of battles in this country. From women fighting for the right to vote in 1920, to women being able to go to college to get jobs. More recently, we have things like equal pay, women being paid equally to men. Girls being able to play sports in schools. All of these were different, gender equality battles. And people that identify as transgender, too. People whose gender identity differs from the sex that they were born with. They experience discrimination in our country as well. And so we have lots of different groups of people right here in the United States and around the world, too, that experience hate and discrimination, not because they had done anything wrong, just because of who they are. That's why it's so important to stand up against discrimination, because we're helping create a world where people are treated equally no matter who they are. And things like our race, our gender, those are things that often we can't hide. Things like our sexuality, our religious beliefs, those are things we shouldn't have to hide. People should be treated equally no matter who they are. And that starts with us standing up against discrimination and trying to make our world a more equal place for everyone. Now, this is exactly what people were doing during the civil rights movement. People were standing up against racial discrimination. Our country has been, unequal towards people of different races throughout our history. If you think about slavery, slavery existed for hundreds of years even before the United States became a country. We have generations of people with essentially no rights and no freedoms here in the United States. Now, once slavery ended here in the U.S. in the 1860s, white people and black people's rights were still not equal here in our country. In fact, we entered into a period of time from the late 1800s to the mid-1900s called the Jim Crow era. Now, during this era, there were lots of laws and systems that were put into place to limit the rights and freedoms of black people here in this country. Things like, segregation, the separation of public spaces based on race. Things like schools, businesses, even things like bathrooms and water. We had things like discrimination in voting. Laws that were put into place, like poll taxes, so people had to pay money to vote, or a language test, so people had to take a written test to vote. That were made to bar people from exercising that right to vote. Things like discrimination in housing and jobs. And so I'm going to show you guys a film now that's going to walk us through some of those freedoms that people were fighting for during the civil rights